You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Hi, I'm Dr. Pamela Kreiser, and welcome back to NCR 507, which is Research Design and Interpretation. I'm excited to talk to you today about the topics that we're going to cover on the show. We have two main areas we're going to be talking about. One is survey methods, and then the other is to really start our long conversation about program evaluation. Now, first we're going to start with survey methods. And surveys are very common. I'm sure you have taken many surveys yourself. I know that sometimes I am hit with a survey even when I'm not ready for it. So I might go to my mailbox and find that someone has surveyed me in my mailbox. And we just know that survey methods are very common. Sometimes I'll get actually, and some of you have had this before, where you actually get money inside your surveys. And that is given to you with the expectation that you'll have more motivation maybe to complete the survey. I find that kind of interesting. I've had $1, $2, and $5 sent to me before for me to complete that survey. And then, of course, I, like you, sometimes buy things on the internet. And I know that occasionally, or actually often by Amazon, I'm hit with a survey after I've purchased that product where they're looking for my feedback. Or perhaps maybe you go to places like Disneyland, and when you walk through the gates, one of the first things they want to do is collect some information from you about some kind of variable they're analyzing. And they might do an in-person, like a face-to-face survey method. So we see surveys all over our world, just all over. And as we talk about it, of course, we don't want to just enter into survey methodology without some kind of strategy. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about that. I know there's some different videos I posted to help you with that as well. But as we talk about today's show, we're going to not just talk about the survey methods and some of the details about those different methodological approaches, but we're also going to tie it back to SPSS, because one of the things that I've learned is that surveys are great, but many people don't know, after they get survey data back, they don't know what to do with it. And so today we're going to cover that as well. Talk about what do you do with the survey data, and then in future shows we'll talk about what you do for analysis.
Today we're inundated by surveys and public opinion polls, and not just during election season. Buy something over the internet, you'll probably get an email with the link to a customer satisfaction survey. Take a class at a university, expect a teaching evaluation survey at the end of the semester. Two things are driving this dramatic increase in the use of survey research. First is that new technology has made conducting surveys a lot cheaper. Second, in our new information society, collecting up-to-date data on human behavior is increasingly important. Not surprising, this constant barrage of survey requests has created some skepticism among the public as to the usefulness of surveys and their trustworthiness. But surveys are not being conducted just to annoy you. Surveys cost money, although less than in the past, and are still time-consuming to conduct. So someone thinks this information is important, and you might be surprised how your life is greatly influenced by the results of surveys. The Bureau of Labor Statistics conducts monthly surveys on consumers like you and of retail establishments around the country. This information is used to take a comprehensive appraisal of prices in the U.S. Besides affecting your paycheck, it may influence how much interest you pay on your credit card, car loan, or home mortgage. The Federal Reserve uses the information from these surveys to decide whether or not to raise interest rates. It isn't just your personal finances that are affected by surveys. It's your tax money too. Where your federal taxes go is partially determined by the data collected by the U.S. Census. The surveys collected by the U.S. Census help determine the amount of money cities and states receive from the federal government. Can't be bothered to fill out the census form? No time? Your county and your state may not get their fair share of over $400 billion of federal funding that is determined in part by the responses people give to the U.S. Census. Don't care about money? What about the National Health Interview Survey? The Center for Disease Control Prevention has been using this survey to monitor the health of the nation since 1957. Want to know how many people don't have health insurance? This survey will help tell you. Not interested in health? What about crime? The National Crime Victimization Survey is the nation's primary source of information on criminal victimization. The survey covers around 90,000 households and contains information on nearly 160,000 people and their experiences with crime. We could go on all day describing how surveys directly or indirectly influence your finances, health, safety, and even happiness. And oh yeah, there are plenty of surveys about happiness. Want to know where the happiest place on earth is? No, it's not Disneyland. According to some survey research, it's Denmark. The World Happiness Report, published by the United Nations, uses survey data to rank 156 countries, and Denmark was the highest ranked nation for health and happiness 2 years in a row. Remember, the next time someone asks you to complete a survey, it's not just to annoy you. They're likely collecting important information that may have an impact on your life.
So it's true, surveys are everywhere, and we know that they aren't going away. So the next clip we're going to look at talks about 4 different areas of survey methods that we might use. We have face-to-face, we have online, we have mail, and then we also have phone surveys. And we'll talk about each of those in this next clip.
Surveys are a useful way to collect information about a range of topics, and there are different types of surveys depending on what kind of information you need. We'll briefly talk about 4 different types of surveys: telephone surveys, mail surveys, face-to-face surveys, and online surveys. Because most everyone has access to a phone, and because phone numbers in part can be randomly generated, telephone surveys are a great way to get a random sample from a large population. The downside of a telephone survey is that it can cost a lot of money, and many people screen their calls using caller ID. Mail surveys are useful because generally most people have a permanent address where they receive mail. And organizations can obtain a database from the U.S. Postal Service that contains every delivery address in the country. That way you could send a questionnaire to a random sample of people in a given location. Mail surveys also allow respondents to take the survey in the privacy of their own home and at a time that is convenient for them. Although relatively inexpensive, mail surveys have a low response rate, since many people might think the survey is junk mail or they forget to complete or return the survey. Face-to-face surveys are probably the most expensive surveys, especially when you want to conduct a lot of interviews and those interviews are spread across a large geographic area. One of the biggest benefits of a face-to-face survey is the higher response rate. People are generally more likely to agree to answer a survey when they're asked by a person standing right in front of them. Online surveys are useful because they tend to be much cheaper than telephone, mail, and face-to-face surveys. This is especially true if you have access to your target population's email addresses. If you don't, then you may need access to an online panel. An online panel is made up of people who have been recruited or have volunteered to take online surveys. They provide their contact information to a company or organization that then sends them different surveys via the internet. These respondents usually get some type of small financial incentive for every survey they complete. Like mail surveys, online surveys allow respondents to take the survey at a time and location that is convenient for them. Which type of survey you need depends on a variety of factors. Here are 3 basic questions that you need to ask yourself when conducting survey research. First, what type of questions are you going to ask? If they're very personal questions, then a mail or online survey might work better than a telephone or face-to-face survey. Some survey questions require a respondent to view a video beforehand. In that case, an online survey may be necessary. Second, what's the best way of getting a hold of your target population? Not everyone has easy access to the internet, so an internet survey might not be appropriate for certain target populations. Some hard-to-reach populations, such as homeless people, might require researchers to go to locations where such individuals hang out and conduct face-to-face surveys. Third, how much time and money do you have? If you need to predict the outcome of an election happening next week, a telephone survey is probably your best bet. A mail survey would take way too long, but telephone surveys can be expensive. Face-to-face surveys can take the longest amount of time to complete and can also be the most expensive, but because of higher response rates, they can be the most accurate. Each of these 4 types of surveys has different strengths and weaknesses. Because of this, you'll sometimes see a study that uses more than one survey method to reach a target population. A researcher needs to assess which type of survey best gets at the information needed, balanced by which method can be completed given specific time and budgetary constraints.
So as we can see, there are a lot of important questions that we have to ask ourselves as the researchers who are conducting survey methodology. Now, of course, the overarching idea here is response rates. You could hear that throughout that whole video. The notion that I have to get to a place where I get response rates that are useful to me in my research. And to the extent that I don't get that, well, then I don't really have much, do I? Now, the next clip we're going to watch is a set of tips for those of us who are conducting survey methodology, and it's 10 tips for us to follow as we go through the stages of getting that survey method to work.
The principal goal of surveys is to inform and simplify the world around us by giving us key pieces of information. Somewhat ironically, that goal of simplification involves many complicated steps. Join me, and we'll walk through 10 steps in conducting surveys. Keep in mind that these steps are broad brushstrokes. They're easy to describe, but often hard to execute. Step 1. Know your population. In their most basic form, surveys are a tool to represent a broader group. You have to decide that group and your reason for studying them early on. Are you interested in an entire country, a region, or a rare population of certain individuals? Step 2. Determine a mode. Will your survey be face-to-face, online, mail, or telephone? No survey mode is perfect for all scenarios. You have to choose the mode carefully in light of your needs and resources. Step 3. Create a questionnaire. Surveys need questions. No brainer, huh? In practice, writing good questions requires painstaking consideration. Step 4. Test your questionnaire. So you think you wrote awesome questions, huh? Well, when I sing in the shower, I think I could tour with Conway Twitty.
Hello, darling.
All survey questions should be pre-tested either by focus groups, cognitive interviewing, split ballot experiments, field pre-testing, or some other method. Step 5. Get a good sample. Sampling is the magic of surveys. Your sample consists of the people you are trying to interview. A great questionnaire will yield a junk survey with a bad sample. Step 6. Collect the data. This is where we find more tricky bits. Collecting data ultimately involves making phone calls, knocking on doors, posting HTML, or mailing paper. Data collection must be rigorous, documented, and consistent. Step 7. Organize and clean the data. Suppose you did a telephone survey with a Caddy system. You just got a data set that looks like a messy spreadsheet with questions in strange orders scattered across multiple columns. You also probably have many pieces of information that need to be rescaled and renumbered, precisely and accurately. This is also a good time to calculate response rates, a quality measure consisting of the number of completed interviews divided by the valid sample. Step 8. Weight the data. Now, even if you did everything perfectly up to this step, your final sample of respondents probably won't perfectly match the population. Post-stratification weighting will now help you to correct many known imbalances. Step 9. Analyze the data. Ain't nobody got time for that fancy spreadsheet. Survey analysis is fascinating, addictive, and extremely useful. You want to present question order, wording, and basic descriptive statistics by creating a top-line report. Then you might want to explore subpopulations with crosstabs. You might even poke at causal relationships using regression. Graphics are cool too. Step 10. Present the results. If you conducted a good survey, you just spent a lot of money to share valuable information with important people. You now need to communicate your results to your audience in a way that is accessible and interesting. Finally, give someone a high five, because you've just gone through the process of a survey. Now let's do a quick review of those 10 steps. Step 1. Know your population. Step 2. Determine a mode. Step 3. Create a questionnaire. Step 4. Test your questionnaire. Step 5. Get a good sample. Step 6. Collect the data. Step 7. Organize and clean the data. Step 8. Weight the data. Step 9. Analyze the data. And Step 10. Present the results. 10 steps. Survey excellence.
I like these 10 steps because I think it gives us a way to make survey method a step-by-step process. And honestly, that's what it really is. But I also think on top of all of those 10 steps, we have to insert common sense. So one of the areas that I hear about a lot, and you've heard in these videos so far, is the idea of phone interviewing. And I have to say, I think we are starting to find that we are getting out of that as being a methodology that works so well. Sometimes I'll survey my undergraduate classes and I'll ask them how many of them have a home phone, and they will say about half of them don't have a home phone. And so as we change that, then of course, the idea behind that is that if we do home phone surveys where we want to call people like we did back 30 years ago, we find that a different population is answering that phone. And then you heard also the caution in the video that when we have caller ID and when we have these different identifiers, many of us simply aren't answering the call. And so if you think about the response rate there for a phone interview, of course, that's going to be a challenge. Equally challenging, of course, is the online format. The idea that many of us, when we see the progress bar along the top, maybe we'll just get out of the survey because it's taking too long. So part of the decision of common sense surrounding like our guiding principle on those 10 steps is to say, if you were taking the survey, what would you think of this? Like, what are your thoughts about it as the taker of the survey that you're designing? And as you do that, then maybe you can see some holes or some areas of improvement in the survey that you're conducting. Now, this next clip is about more details about surveys, and we can learn from their experience.
When we're conducting a survey, we like to make sure we're asking questions that will collect accurate and useful information. But it isn't always obvious what makes a survey question a good survey question. Here are 7 tips that can help in developing good survey questions. 1. A good question is one where all respondents interpret the question in a consistent manner. That's not always easy to achieve. The question, "Have you ever been the victim of a serious crime?" might be interpreted differently by different people. Is getting your car stolen a serious crime? Probably. What about your bicycle? What about your skateboard? Make sure your questions are as clear and as specific as possible. 2. A good question is also one where people are willing to answer the question. If a survey asks about very personal things such as sexual behavior or drug use, you might find lots of people unwilling to answer such questions. If you need to ask personal questions, you need to craft those questions carefully and explain to the respondent why you need this information and assure them that you'll keep their responses confidential or even anonymous. 3. A good question is one that a respondent will answer truthfully. Let's take the following question as an example. Do you own a library card? Seems clear enough, and it doesn't seem too personal, but surprisingly, lots of respondents might say yes, even when they don't have a library card. Why is that? It's something called social desirability. Reading books, being well read, is socially desirable. So someone who never goes to the library might not want to admit that they don't have a library card for fear that they might be judged negatively. It might be better to ask the question this way. Some people get books from the library, others buy them from bookstores or online. Do you currently have a library card or not? That might sound a little awkward, but you're more likely to get a more truthful answer. 4. A good question is one that a respondent can actually answer. If you ask someone how much money they spend on groceries in an average month, you might be surprised how many people would say they weren't sure. Make sure people have the knowledge or information to answer your survey question. 5. Avoid double-barreled questions. These are questions that ask for a single answer to a question that really has 2 different parts. For example, let's say you are asked the following question. Do you believe the United States should spend more money on education and less money locking up non-violent criminals? That's a double-barreled question. Respondents who agree with one part but not the other will have trouble answering this question. You should break that question into 2 separate questions. 6. Avoid biased terms or wording. This is probably the hardest thing to do when writing questions. Should you use the term Obamacare or use the Affordable Care Act? Should you use the term welfare or should you say assistance to the poor? It isn't obvious which is the better terminology, but different terms will likely lead to different answers. Surveys will sometimes give one question to half the sample and a slightly different worded question to another half to see how respondents react to the different wording. 7. Pre-test your questions. This is the most important tip. You need to try out your questions on real people and then ask for feedback. Were they confused by a question? Did they answer in a way that surprised you? Pre-testing will help you find out if you have any problems with your questions. Of course, there is no such thing as a perfect survey question. Instead, our goal is to create questions that elicit meaningful responses. Surveys take time and money. We don't want to waste our time and the respondents' time asking bad questions. Following these 7 tips can help you craft clear and useful survey questions.
I agree. I think that when we talk about the idea of survey construction, that last step that he talked about is this idea that we have to pre-test those questions. And you heard me talk about that a few minutes ago, this idea that we need to pre-test these questions, see how real people respond to them, and then we'll know what kind of revisions we have to make. I know that whenever I'm even doing a training or any set of directions, I always do that because sometimes what I think is clear isn't clear to the person who is on the other end. So the other 8th step that I would add to that video is to keep it simple. And this is a theme you're going to hear throughout this show today, this idea that we need to step back and take a more simplified approach and ask really basic questions and keep the wording simple and keep the notions clear and to think of all the ways that we present things that might not be clear and kind of just keep them on a very simple level. Now, of course, conducting questions or constructing questions is a very important part of this, the survey design. And as we do that, of course, we're going to try to have it be the best survey we can possible, but we know that there will be flaws in any kind of survey. This next video talks about 3 areas of caution as we put those surveys together.
In this video, we will be talking about census, non-response, and undercoverage. Recall that a sample is part of the population that is taken out for examination. We use a sample to draw conclusions about the population because it should be representative of the population. The larger the sample size, the more representative it tends to be of the population. An even more accurate way of getting data about a population is by taking a census. A census surveys each and every person of a population. However, we have to be aware of the problems about sampling in general. When we are sampling, we cannot force someone to give us information. The respondents can choose not to be contacted or can choose not to answer. This is called non-response. On the other hand, we can have people in a population that have absolutely no chance of being included in the sample. This is called undercoverage. For example, if a researcher wants to gather a sample by calling random phone numbers, there are 3 possibilities. The first possibility is that the other person picks up the phone and allows him or herself to be interviewed and be part of the sample. The second possibility is that the other person just hangs up the phone. This would be non-response because they are choosing not to answer. The third possibility is that the phone number does not exist. The researcher can call as many phone numbers as he wants, but the problem is that not everyone has a phone number because they do not own a telephone. As a result, people that don't own a telephone have no chance of being included in the sample. This would be an example of undercoverage.
So as we can see, we have to use common sense approaches to understand who we're including in our sample and who we're leaving out. Now, the next part of our show is to talk about what you do after that survey's been distributed and you've collected the data. Now, of course, we're not going to get into analysis. What I want to talk about is that step of what do you do with the answers that you get and where do you put them? Now, part of our project in our class is to use a program called SPSS, and that's the Statistical Package for the Social Sciences. We use this to process data, and of course, there's a lot of other designs out there, or programs out there that will do the same task, but this is a central one. For those of you who do stats, you know that this is true. And so what I want to talk about now is the idea of after you get those results, how do you put them into a data matrix in terms of SPSS? And so let's take a look at this first clip and we can learn the initial steps to getting this done.
In this video, we'll take a look at how to enter questionnaire or survey data into SPSS. And this is something that a lot of people have questions with. So it's important to make sure when you're working with SPSS, in particular, when you're entering data from a survey, that you know how to do. So let's go ahead and take a few moments to look at that. And here you see on the right-hand side of your screen, I have a questionnaire, a very short sample questionnaire that I want to enter into SPSS. So we're going to create a data file. And in this questionnaire here, I've made a few modifications. I've underlined some variable names here, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. And I also put numbers in parentheses to the right of these different names. And I'll also explain that as well. Now, normally when someone sees this survey, we wouldn't have gender underlined, for example, nor would we have these numbers to the right of male and female. So that's just for us to help better understand how to enter these data. So let's go ahead and get started here. In SPSS, the first thing we need to do is, every time we have a possible answer, such as male or female, we need to create a variable in SPSS that will hold those different answers. So our first variable needs to be gender, and that's why that's underlined there, just to assist us as we're doing this. So we want to make sure we're in the Variable View tab, and then in the first row here under Name, we want to type gender, and then press Enter, and that creates the variable gender. Now notice here I have two options, male and female. So when people respond or circle or check here that they're a male, I need to enter into SPSS some number to indicate that. So we always want to enter numbers whenever possible into SPSS, because SPSS, for the vast majority of analyses, performs statistical analyses on numbers, not on words. So I wouldn't want to enter male, female, and so forth. I want to enter ones, twos, and so on. So notice here, I just arbitrarily decided males get a 1 and females get a 2. It could have been the other way around, but since male was the first name listed, I went ahead and gave that a 1, and then for females I gave it 2. So what we want to do in our data file here is go ahead and go to Values, this column, click on the None cell. Notice these 3 dots appear. They're called an ellipsis. Click on that. And then our first value, notice here, 1 is male. So value of 1, and then type label male, and then click Add. And then our second value of 2 is for females. So go ahead and enter 2 for value, and then female, click Add. And then we're done with that. You want to see both of them down here, and that looks good. So click OK. Now those labels are in here, and I'll show you how that works when we enter some numbers in a minute. Okay, next we have ethnicity. So I'm going to call this variable ethnicity. So go ahead and type that in, press Enter. And then we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create value labels here. So 1 is African American, 2 is Asian American, and so on. And I'll just do that very quickly. So going to Values column, click on that ellipsis. For 1, we have African American. For 2, Asian American. 3 is Caucasian. And just so you can see that here, 3 is Caucasian, 4 is Hispanic, and other is 5. So let's go ahead and finish that. 4 is Hispanic. 5 is other, so let's go ahead and do that. 5 is other. Okay, and that's it for that variable. Now we do have, it says please state. I'll talk about that next. That's important. When they can enter text, we have to handle that differently. But for now, we have our 5 possible options coded in here. So that's perfect, so click OK. Now next, say someone checks this box here, other, they get a 5 for ethnicity. But then they state something like biracial. So whenever we have a box or an entry that people can type something in, that needs its own variable. So here in row 3, we're going to enter other ethnicity. Okay, and then we don't want it to be numeric. That means it's going to be a number. And it's not, it's going to be text here. So go ahead and click on numeric, click on the 3 dots, and then select string. And string indicates that you can have text. And then let's change our characters to 25. That will allow 25 spaces, and then we're done there. So string is entered. Okay, our next is age. And then notice for age, they're going to enter their age, and we ask for it in years. So they'll enter 22, 43, or what have you. So we don't actually have to make codes like 1 for male, 2 for female, and so on. that value is going to be entered directly. So here, all we have to do is create the variable age and then press enter. And then next, we have 5 questions from what's called the satisfaction with life scale. And here people read the statements, and it says that below are 5 statements you may agree or disagree with, using a 1 to 7 scale where SD is strongly disagree and SA is strongly agree. Answer each of the following as they apply to yourself. So the first statement on the scale is, in most ways, my life is close to my ideal. And then a person will circle one of these values, indicating whether they tend to agree with the statement or tend to disagree with it. If someone very much agreed with the statement, then they'd circle 7, saying they strongly agreed. If they agreed somewhat, they'd probably circle a 5 or maybe a 6, and so on. Now notice we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions on this scale. And this is a real scale by Diener, Satisfaction with Life Scale. It's a very popular scale. And what I'm going to do in SPSS is, notice a person will answer one of these 7 choices here. They'll give one of these answers. They'll circle a 4 or 6 or what have you. So anytime someone answers a value, it needs to have a variable. So I need to create a variable in SPSS for this question or statement, a variable for this statement, and so on. And I'm going to call it the Satisfaction with Life Scale, or SWLS for short, 1 for the first question on it. This will be SWLS 2, and so on. So let's go ahead and create those. So I have SWLS 1, and I'll just press enter. SWLS 2, these don't have to be in caps, but I'm just doing that. SWLS 4, and then SWLS 5. Now, we could go ahead for our own notes and code what these values mean if we want to. 1 is strongly disagree, 7 is strongly agree, and so on. And I'll go ahead and do that. I'll just code the extremes. So here a value of 1 is strongly agree. Let's make sure that's right. Nope, a value of 1 is strongly disagree. So it's important to double check that to make sure we get it right. And then a value of 7 is strongly agree, as is shown here. So let's make sure that checks out. 1 is strongly disagree. 7 is strongly agree. So that looks good. Click OK. And then something that's nice here, I can just copy this and then select these and select paste, and it will paste all of those value labels to the remaining questions. So that saves us a lot of time. And that's only something we want to do when the variables share the same structure. So in other words, SWLS has 1 is strongly disagree, 7 is strongly agree. Well, so does the rest of these, so we can go ahead and copy those. Okay, so that looks good. We can go to the Data View tab now, and here are our variables. Gender, ethnicity, the other ethnicity, that once again is if someone has an answer like biracial, age, and then the 5 items on the Satisfaction with Life scale. So let's go ahead and take an example and enter some data.
So partway through this example, I want to stop here and just summarize what we've seen. So we've seen the notion that I create a survey, and then I have to look at that hard copy of the survey and identify each of the areas of information that I'm going to place in a matrix. And so the video basically showed us that for each question, essentially, I have it as a variable. And I might do things with that later in terms of my analysis, but that's how I categorize it onto the spreadsheet. And then we saw that you could go into variable view and you could modify some of the details of the variables, so like whether it's string or whether it's numeric. And then we could also modify features of the answer classification labels. And so we saw like the example of males having an identified number as 1, and females having an identified number as 2. It could be anything, any number for anything. But we saw that we have to attach numbers because SPSS is largely or almost entirely a numeric data analysis program. And so when we integrate string or when we integrate numeric properties, then of course we understand that those exist there, and we're trying to get as many of them to be as numeric as possible. So in summary, we kind of saw the first steps here toward taking that survey and then saying, gosh, what do I do with the information that I get? And we would want to also acknowledge that each row represents a survey that you received back. So as you see on that left-hand column of the matrix, you know that each one indicates a different survey. And then as we start to fill in the matrix, then we're able to start seeing the whole picture come alive. Let's continue with an example.
Here. Suppose, for example, that we had a male who was Hispanic, and to make it easy, they answered, let's say, 6 on each of these questions. Okay, so our gender, male, they would get a 1 for gender, so we'll enter a 1. For ethnicity, they're Hispanic, so they would get a 4. Now, this answer here, other ethnicity, only applies if someone answered other or 5 and they stated something. If they did, then we would type it in, such as biracial. But they did not, so we're going to just press delete there. So we just skip over it. Let's say the person was 25, and then recall the answer to 6 on all 5 of the items on satisfaction with life scale. Okay, so that looks good. Say the second person is female, so 2. They were Caucasian, let's say, so 3 here. So we're going to skip other ethnicity. They were 21, and then they answered, say, 7s on the satisfaction with life scale. Okay, and then one more, let's say another female, so that would be a 2. And this person was other for race, and they were biracial. They wrote in on the form, so we would put that. And then their age was 32, and this person answered 3 on the first 3 questions and 4 on the last 2. And we would see that just by looking at their form and seeing what they circled. Okay, so that's a basic example for entering data, creating a data file from a questionnaire and entering some values as well. Now, we'll do an analysis in a minute, but there's one other thing that you might want to consider. Often if we have hard copies of these surveys, if we've administered them to people by hand, then often we'll want to keep track of each individual survey with a number. We'll have a ID number on the survey, such as this may be 001 if it's the first person. The next one could be 002 and so forth. So if I want to record that, then what I want to do is make a modification of this data set here. Let's take a look at that. That can be very useful. This will illustrate how to enter or insert a variable and how to insert it where you want it to be, and also how to create a ID variable which will not be a number, but instead it will be treated as text. And I'll show you what I mean here. So let's go right here, click on gender, and then right click the mouse button and then select insert variable, and notice how that put it right before gender. It's just what we want, so that's perfect. We'll call this ID, and then under type we're going to select string, click OK, and then let's go ahead and go to data view, and notice how that's once again to the left of gender, and then we'll type 001 for the first person, 002 for the second, 003, and we could just do that all the way down as we had more people or what have you. Okay, I'll go ahead and delete these 2 though. Select those and press the delete key. And then that looks good. We've got our data set here, and we could run some basic analyses, such as we could run, actually one more thing. Let's take a look at this before we do that. Let's go ahead and click on this button here. This is known as our value labels button. If I click on that, notice what happens here. We have our males and females, they're displayed, and then the ethnicity is displayed. And then here, if someone answered a 1 or a 7, that label of either strongly agree or strongly disagree is displayed. As you can see here, strongly agree. If I click on that again, it turns it off. And you can leave it on if you want, it's just a preference. And then let's go ahead and do a basic analysis. So let's find the frequency of these 2 variables here. So how many males there are, how many females, and then how many of each ethnicity. Now obviously, when we only have 3 people, we could just look at this and tell very quickly. But pretend we have hundreds of people or what have you. So we go to Analyze, Descriptive Statistics, and then frequencies. And then go ahead and move gender and ethnicity over. And then the default for statistics, there are none here. And for now, we'll just leave it as is. We'll just go ahead and get display frequency tables. So click OK. And then we have our output window that opens. And we can see here that we have 1 male, 2 females for a total of 3. And it says missing system 2, and I'll show you about that in a minute. And then for ethnicity, we have 1 Caucasian, 1 Hispanic, 1 other, and we see this missing 2 again. This means that we don't have, for some reason, 2 of our ethnicities are not reported. Let's try and figure out what was going on there. So I'll go back to my data editor window. Well, if you recall, a minute ago I entered 004, 005, right? And I said, let's go ahead and delete those. Well, if you notice here, it's kind of hard to see, but there's little periods here. When I deleted these values, SPSS still kept these 2 rows active in a sense. Notice that 4 and 5 here are in boldface type, whereas these are grayed out. So SPSS is treating these as if we have 2 observations here, and they're just calling those missing. Now, we can get rid of that very easily. If we just select and drag on these 2 rows, on the row headings here, which is what these are called, right-click, select Clear. Now notice the periods are gone. Let's go back and rerun our frequencies. So Analyze Descriptive Statistics, Frequencies, and then just click OK. And then now notice, do you see the missing anymore? It's not there, right? That removed it, and that was the reason why it was there in the first place, because we entered those ID numbers, deleted them, but the rows were still active from the perspective of SPSS. So it interpreted those 2 rows as missing. But now that's gone. And notice here one other thing. We have male and female, not 1 and 2. That's another benefit of creating these value labels here. Behind the scenes, SPSS displays or knows that a 1 is male and 2 is female. So when we run our analysis, instead of having a 1 here, we have male. Instead of 2, we have female. And the same thing with ethnicity. And that really helps when you're interpreting your results, especially if you go back to the data after some time. It's easy to forget who was a 1 and who was a 2, for example. So by coding males 1, females 2, we always have that memory in our data file. So we don't have to try and go back and figure out who was who. Okay, one last analysis. Go to Analyze Descriptive Statistics, and then this time choose Descriptives. Let's go ahead and move age and all the satisfaction with life variables over. And if you're curious, I grabbed all of those by clicking on age, pressing and holding the Shift key, and then clicking on the last value, and that grabs them all at once. That's kind of nice. It saves us a little bit of time. So then move that over, click on Options. We get the mean or the arithmetic average, standard deviation minimum and maximum by default. We'll go ahead and leave those on, that's fine. So click Continue and then OK. And then here we can see the mean for age. We have a mean age of 26 with a minimum of 21 and a maximum of 32. And then we see our satisfaction with life values. The smallest was 3 for 1, 2, and 3, and a 4 for 4 and 5, and the largest was 7 for all of them. And then you can see the means here as well and the standard deviations. All right, so that's about it for creating a data file from questionnaire or survey data in SPSS. Thanks for watching.
So as you can see, there are very specific ways for us to take the data that we collect on surveys and then move it into SPSS. Now, one question you might be wondering about is, are there ways for us to automatically move it into SPSS? And actually the answer is yes. Most online programs that we use when we do online surveys actually have this built in. So I use a program called Qualtrics, and some of you might use SurveyMonkey or Survey Gizmo, any of the other products that are out there. There's a whole bunch of them. And usually attached to those online features are these boxes that you can check that will take the data directly from that user and then put it into a spreadsheet that you create and design and then automatically give it to you as the researcher. Some of them even you can pick the analysis that you want to do ahead of time and have that done as well. So it's pretty advanced in terms of where we've come in the online data collection method. However, we have a more important question to think about. And that is, can I get people to go online and do my survey? And that still is a really crucial question for every survey methodologist to ask him or herself. Can I get people to respond? Because I can have a very slick system, like an online way of doing things, but if I can't get the data, then I don't really have anything. Now, the next part of our show is going to be centered around program evaluation. And this is a very important area. It's an area where I get job offers all the time. People ask me to do program evaluations. It seems like there's endless programs out there and a lot of projects where people could get employment. Not that it's highly lucrative, but it could be if you did a lot of program evaluations. So one of the things we want to talk about is how does that relate to this class? Well, first we want to say that these are evaluations of programs that exist in our world. And our program is interested in our contributions to society. In other words, we're interested in matters that center around negotiation, conflict resolution, and peace building. Well, immediately you think of lots of programs out there. And as we think about these programs, we know that they undergo evaluation, sometimes to prove their worth, sometimes to get funding, sometimes to get all of those things. But as we think about program evaluation, of course, we have to think about it as a really key contribution we can make to society. So we're going to start this conversation of program evaluation by looking at this first video that gives us a great overview.
This is a brief introduction to the field of program evaluation. Program evaluation is the use of social research procedures to systematically investigate the effectiveness of programs. And the field of program evaluation and the field of research are very closely linked. The key difference between the two is that in the field of program evaluation, we are making value judgments about a program, whereas in research, the findings are presented, for example, statistically significant findings, but there's not a value judgment attached to those. Rossi identified 5 program domains. And this is 5 areas where evaluation work is done. The first is in the area of needs assessments. So looking at whether there is a need for a program or service. The second is evaluating the design of a program or service. The third is looking at the implementation of a program or service or a process evaluation. The fourth is looking at an outcome evaluation of a program or service. This is often called a summative evaluation. And closely linked to that, but further down the line, is an impact evaluation. And we'll talk about the difference between an outcome and impact evaluation in a moment. And the fifth area is evaluating the efficiency of a program or service. I'm just going to briefly talk about 2 of the most common ones that you'll find in the area of program evaluation. The first is a process evaluation, or sometimes called a formative evaluation, and sometimes called an implementation evaluation. And this is really looking at the program as it's being rolled out and asking questions about how it's being rolled out and whether the way it's being rolled out will likely lead to meeting the outcomes as set by the program. So for example, if we have a program in which there's 15 sessions and they are based on a curriculum, are all the sessions being delivered? Are they being delivered as they were written? Are they being delivered in the time sequence that was recommended? Are there factors outside of the actual written curriculum that can impact the delivery of the program? Were the people delivering the program trained well enough? So it asks all kinds of questions related to how a program is being rolled out. What is supporting the rollout of a program and what is hindering the rollout of a program? The next type of evaluation is an outcome evaluation, often called a summative evaluation. And this is looking at a program and whether the program met the outcomes that it was intended to meet. So if we had a 15-session program designed to increase social skills, we want to know, did that program actually lead to an increase in social skills among the participants? And we would look at the specific outcomes and evaluate each of those outcomes. So I just want to briefly talk about impact evaluations as the last point in this brief presentation. So often we hear impact evaluation and outcome evaluation used interchangeably. And while an impact evaluation is looking at outcomes, it looks at more than that. So an impact evaluation really is an evaluation that is looking at long-term and deeper outcomes. It also is looking at trying to figure out to what degree can outcomes be attributed to the program that we're examining, and to what degree do we have to credit other things in the environment that may have led to program outcomes. So for example, if you have a program that's focusing on poverty reduction, and we find out that actually while our program is running, there was also some changes in policy in our favor to help people reduce poverty. And there was also other programs in the community that were supporting people. We have to try to tease out as best we can what slice of the pie can we take credit for, and where is credit due in other areas. The same can be said for outcomes that aren't so favorable. We want to look at what influenced outcomes that weren't very favorable, whether it was policies or other situations happening in the community. So that's just a brief overview of evaluation. If you have any comments or questions, please feel free to go to the website, www.outclasseducationandtrain.com, and send an email.
So that gives us a general view of program evaluation as a topical area. And of course, we're going to dive deep into this topic as we start to work on our projects for our class. Here's how I want you to think about it. As we think about program evaluation, I want you to think about it as research with evaluative terms. What does that mean? It's not just research for research's sake, it's research in that context of evaluation. Now, I'm excited for the next part of our show, and that's to bring on a friend of mine, Dr. Kieran Moss, who is a program evaluator. And when we come back, we will have a chance to talk with her about the basics of great program evaluation.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
Now I'd like to welcome program evaluator Dr. Kieran Moss. She is with us on a Skype interview, and we're going to learn from her about the basics of program evaluation. Welcome to the show, Kieran.
Good morning. How are you, Pamela?
I'm great. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let me start with asking you a little bit about your background.
Sure. Well, certainly. I have actually did an undergraduate in communications, a master's in communications. And what I realized was a lot of the information that I was looking at in terms of research variables were related to education. And that led me to pursue a doctoral degree in education, looking specifically at what are the variables related to either student or administration or school persistence and success, and conversely, school, student, and administration failure.
Okay. And so then did you automatically get involved in program evaluation in your studies, or was that something that you pursued afterward?
I think that program evaluation goes hand in hand with anybody, and I think that we all do it without even realizing. When we evaluate a program, it's the nature of just looking at something objectively and asking ourselves, is this being done as best as it could be done? And so if that's serving ice cream, if that's driving your car a specific route, if that's, getting your hair cut, if that's determining whether or not K through 12 education is being delivered as effectively as possible, It's the same question. It's just using the same set of basic principles to answer that information.
Okay, so then we're all sort of program evaluators on some level then.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it, Pam. I think the nature of humans are to look at ways to look, can we improve what we're currently doing the way we're doing it? And if the answer is yes, then you do it. And if the answer is no, then you stick with what you're doing. And so it's really trial and error. The difference really fundamentally is that with a scientific approach to program evaluation, you really start thinking, what are the questions that we want answered? In other words, it's not, am I serving ice cream better? It's, am I serving ice cream that's good for me, that's healthy for me? So it really becomes about how are you slicing the problem? Because once you slice the problem in the correct way, then you can answer it. And I think the biggest problem most people have is that we're not sure how to tackle a big problem. Like, let's say it's, the global economy. How do we slice it in such a way where we can reveal some absolute truths to try and improve the economics of one specific demographic group in one specific geographic area, and look at tailored mechanisms that can improve the outcome of those people making money in that specific region?
Okay, so then on some level, what I hear you say is that framing is a big part of this in terms of the scope of the project. Is that what you're saying?
Oh, I think that you've hit the nail on the head, Pam. I think that's fundamentally what it's about. If you look at anything, whether it's the nature of love in a relationship, or if you're looking at fundamentally how do we improve the driving conditions on the 110, you can't answer that question. What you can answer are specific variables that encompass that larger issue of what is love or congestion on the 110. So then again, you're slicing the pie. Are you looking at how do you operationalize and define love? Are you defining that as someone who's trustworthy and believable? Okay, we can answer that question. We can evaluate whether or not that single variable is being met as part of the relationship. Conversely, when it comes to the 110, we can ask, what is the driving condition at 6 a.m. At any given day on the 110? And we can numerically count those things. And we can use that data to start evaluating what, and if at all, we can provide recommendations to improve the drive time for people using the 110.
So I hear those examples, and they're really helpful in terms of understanding the general principles behind thinking about program evaluation. I guess one of the questions that I want to ask you about is this whole area seems to have kind of blown up in terms of there's so many jobs out there in program evaluation, so many programs, honestly, that are out there. So when we think about like traditional programs and how people are hired for that kind of job, what kind of skills do you think are necessary to be one of those evaluators?
Yeah, that's a double-edged sword question, Pam. I've got to tell you the truth. I mean, the success of a program is dependent upon having an excellent program evaluator. And the reality is that people have gotten one half of the equation, that they realize that they need to ask questions about the success of the program they're implementing. The second part is, of course, in anything, which is why I think obviously the people who are hopefully watching this right now have you as a faculty member, is that they get an opportunity to learn how to perform and conduct a program evaluation successfully. So two-part answer to a two-part question. Number one, I think it's great that there are more program evaluators in demand in the data that says what are the desirable job characteristics of any employee. But I think that fundamentally, it's like anything. It doesn't matter if you're a mechanic that fixes cars. Just because we have a demand for needing more mechanics doesn't mean that we're going to get our cars fixed more appropriately. I think the skill set comes from really using and applying logic. You have to apply logic. You have to ask, what are the causes that have led to this issue that's under investigation? And again, we can pick a sample question, like let's say pollution measures on Redondo Beach. So say that the city of Redondo Beach has decided that they're going to fund, $100,000 a year for beach cleanup. That's great. It's very noble. It sounds good as a platform. But how do we know what's being done? How do we know that it is in fact being achieved? In other words, are we, and this would be your first general question, are we changing the amount of pollution that's washing up on Redondo Beach. And the only way that we can start that, trying to tease out that metric, in other words, trying to determine if we're accomplishing that goal, is to start with a baseline. So we need to go out today and we need to look at all of the pollutants that have washed up on the beach. We need to categorically look at them. Is it rubber? Is it plastic? What it is. Is it oil that's in the water? Is it a certain type of chemical that's in the water? And we need to determine each of those variables so that then we know there's X number of variables that we're defining and operationalizing as being pollutants. So once we identify, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, so something that you're bringing up is something I don't know that I think I automatically do this, but maybe this is the first step, is a site visit, right? Is to say we can't be away from the thing that we're studying. We have to get right into that site and I guess become familiar with what's obviously there on some level.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I think what you've sort of entered into, Pam, is this discrepancy that occurs in research. In other words, when is qualitative? In other words, when is the touching, the seeing, the tasting, the feeling of a situation important versus when is not? Because you can have an objective quantitative analysis that's conducted without ever needing a site visit. But there are scholars, and I think that many of us, as we move through our years, start to realize that we really need both. We need a mixed methodology. We need to be able to do a site visit, and we also need to aggregate like the test scores or the quantity and pollutants that are occurring. It can't just be one or the other. That really a good program evaluation is looking at the soft variables and the hard, objective, quantitative, quantifiable variables.
So would you recommend then that the first step would be qualitative as opposed to quantitative? Do you have a preference or does that depend?
I think it totally depends. I think as you know, and I think fundamentally your ethos and what you do so successfully is that you have mastered an area that seldom people do, which is being able to understand and quantify variables, and B, being able to let those numbers make meaning. And this is sadly where program evaluation falls short time and time again. So in other words, I can ask students who've been given money from a fund from the federal government about trying to improve their test scores in math and science. Maybe their math and science test scores don't improve, even though we've spent $100 million. A qualitative researcher is going to ask, is the self-efficacy, is the self-esteem higher for the children who had access to that grant money? Mm-hmm. It's kind of a quantitative question, but it's not looking at what you'd be looking at, which is there's either a quasi-experimental or an experimental research design where you have a treatment, which is 10 kids got given funding, 10 kids didn't, and then maybe you'll have a control group, but you're going to end up in a situation where you're not really determining if they're happy or sad, if they're, you're going to have a matched group of kids in either the treatment or the control group, and some of them are going to receive it, some aren't. And you're going to say, look, they both, this group received the treatment, there was no effect size. In other words, what was, or if at all, was the effect of that treatment? Did it change their test scores? Mm-hmm. Because it's so different now, you can't just think that you can answer the questions that are important using just quantitative variables. You also need to look at, as you pointed out, what is qualitatively occurring. You need to be in the setting. You need to feel the setting. You need to be able to look at how is this affecting other variables that, while we hadn't have thought of as being important at the time, that they have emerged, right? So they're phenomenologists. That's the researchers that really are interested in phenomenology. In other words, we didn't come in here with any set of preconceived notions or agenda about what we were going to discover in this evaluation. But since we've been here, what we've discovered is A, B, and C. Mm-hmm. So it really depends how you want to treat the treatment.
Yeah, I think as I'm hearing you talk, I guess what I'm thinking is, maybe part of this is to say there's one of those often is like something that someone favors. Like, so for me, I like a quantitative position to start with. And so maybe what I hear you saying is then I have to be intentional about going out and doing the qualitative work because my tendency is to be quantitative. And maybe the opposite is also true, where somebody is qualitatively maybe more inclined, and then they would have to challenge themselves to say, what quantitative information could we get and what might that mean? So I kind of hear you saying maybe a whole picture perspective, really.
And then and that's really well put. And so therein lies the problem, going back to your initial question in reference to skills. How do you find people who are able to do both things and to do both things in harmony and to allow both things to have a voice in your conclusions and a voice in your recommendations for improved practice? Because remember, the obvious goal of a program evaluator is to provide recommendations for improved practice. In other words, how can we make an offering of strategic, programmatic, and policy-related objectives that we believe, if carried out, will improve the program's success? And so in terms of the skills, that's a tough one. Can anyone be a program evaluator? Sure. Anyone can pick up a football and throw it. Can anyone be a good program? Can anyone be a good program evaluator? No. Not everyone's going to be a quarterback throwing for the Dallas Cowboys. It takes time, it takes energy, and I think for me, it really was, I had access points to people who were really good at doing it and mentorship, and I worked on it in very small quantities. Boom, no pun intended, but I was given small elements of a big picture, and then over time, I started to see how the smaller picture was related to the bigger picture, and then that bigger picture was related to a program. And I think fundamentally, it really is carved, for me at least, in three ways. You're looking at the policy, you're looking at the economic, and you're looking at the social impact of whatever program you're evaluating.
So is it best done in teams? I mean, I a little bit hear that in your answer to say, because none of us are perfectly equipped in all of those areas, is that maybe a better approach? I'm not saying we're doing that with this class, but is that maybe for our perspective to say that's superior possibly?
Again, I think that's a really tough question. I mean, if you have qualified candidates that speak and see and perceive the world the same way you do, then yes, that would be ideal. But I think, as you know full well, being in academia, people get siloed. And so as a consequence, their ability to share and to tackle a problem, it becomes really fundamentally difficult. And so for me, I feel like the further that I've removed myself from academia, the easier it is to look at something objectively, because there isn't that vested interest in truth. Because, of course, there's a competing version of what somebody's perspective is. Like, that's the nature. And again, program evaluation can either be applied. So in other words, you're going to improve the program, or you could just do it for theory testing. So there's program evaluators who don't actually change the outcome of reading and writing tests, who don't actually change the ways in which science and math test scores are affected by the millions of K through 12 students across America. But yet they sit back and they come up with program evaluations that are theoretical. So you've got these two sort of groups, the people that talk about what's wrong with the problem, but actually don't and aren't vested in improving it. And then you've got another group of people who are actually making recommendations for improved practice. And there's a risk in that. And so you can see why there's this other group of people who would rather just theoretically come up with a framework of why it failed. But that's not very useful. We do need to know why something failed. But I think what is needed now is for people to put themselves out there and say, that has failed. Now let's apply what we've learned, right? Because they're the applied theorists, and try and improve the situation. So I think fundamentally that's the difference.
Yeah, very interesting. So tell me, what kind of programs would you delineate that are more suitable or less suitable for program evaluation? Like, are there things we should stay away from? Are there programs that we should go toward? Like, what would you say? I know you said scope is critical. What else would you say is about suitability?
And you mean in reference to being like an activity, a course activity for your students?
It could be that. I mean, it could be for the students, but also just generally, like, are there parts of our world that just really in program evaluation is impossible? Or are there ideas or programs out there that are really suitable? Like you say, that's just a no-brainer.
Well, I mean, I always found that the easiest thing I did when I was teaching 307, the measurements class, which is, as you know, a statistics class, I found it really difficult for students to really understand how and why program evaluation made sense, because it wasn't operationalized in a real setting. And I think, in credence to your ability as being an outstanding faculty member, you've always looked for opportunities to house knowledge in a real setting. And so, and to that end, I did things similarly. And I think that's why you and I could probably do a program evaluation together quite successfully. I would actually have my students go out, and they did mini program evaluations with local nonprofits. Nonprofits, as you know, let's say it's just a small, mid-sized nonprofit feeding into, Carson or Torrance or let's say Wilmington. And maybe there's a nonprofit that's working specifically with teenage girls who are pregnant, who are trying to finish their high school degree, and they're at Harbour College. So you could look at doing a program evaluation for a company like that who doesn't have enough money to barely keep the lights going. And you can do a really simpler program evaluation. It can start with as simple a questions as, how many women who are single mothers who are trying to complete their GEE at Harbour College know that this nonprofit exists? And that type of information, while it be small, yields masses of assumptions about the success and failure of that program.
Right.
And so you could actually go into Harbour College, identify who the population is that you want to get a hold of, literally call them up and ask them, do you know that X nonprofit assists is available to someone for you? And if they answer yes or no, you've got to buy it's too simple. The second thing is, you could do a program evaluation to identify whether or not their outreach that they think that they're doing is effective. So your research question or your evaluation question is or are the flyers that are being administered for this target population of single mothers who are trying to complete their GED at Harbour College, are those flyers actually getting into the hands of that target population? And this is fundamentally what is the biggest thing about program evaluation. For years, people thought program evaluation was just doing the program and saying, we've been successful because we've handed out 10,000 flyers. A good program evaluator asks, how many of the participants who are your target market received the flyer? And that's the distinction. I can say, we've had massive program success. We've given out 10,000 flyers. End of story. Therefore, the funding that you spent for me to create these flyers was an excellent investment in money. But the truth is, and the question is, how many of the specific target market of people who are, who you're after for that nonprofit received that? So, my long-winded answer to you is, I would go after nonprofits. They're in desperate need of program evaluation. Here's another one. When people call their hotline, does anyone answer the phone? When people answer the phone, because it's normally staffed by volunteers, are they perceived as being informative? Are they perceived as being polite? Are they perceived as being, helpful? Those types of evaluation questions can lead to recommendations that can really be a lifeline to nonprofits, but nobody asks those questions. And so the difference between any organization, nonprofit or otherwise, are you, and it's the Japanese philosophy of Kaizen, are you continually improving, right? That's what program improvement is about, objectively and subjectively. Are you achieving, program improvement by evaluating what you're doing and asking people around you, can we do this better?
So I hear a really big theme of simplicity in your answer, which is, let's keep it extremely simple in terms of our program evaluation and ask really basic questions. Because on some level, when you're talking about the flyers, I was thinking, wow, you could actually miss that. You could miss the most important question, which is, are the right people getting the services available to them, right?
Right.
So
it's
interesting. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, this from our old friend Aristotle. Have you utilized all available means of persuasion? It's the same question. It's the same question.
Right. And so then the other comment, and I know we'll talk more about this in the future, but this question about effectiveness seems to be kind of the point. And so it seems like the program evaluator has to really ask hard questions around that theme to say, what do I think effectiveness is? What do I think it looks like when I find it as an outcome? How do I measure it? How do I monitor it? What would you say about that?
No, you again hit the nail on the head. The most important question is to operationalize key terms. In other words, what is program success? And that needs to be reached upon by all of the key stakeholders prior. And so a lot of people are afraid of evaluations, right? So we have something called a friendly evaluation. So I conduct evaluations that are, nasty, and they are aimed and targeted at stripping funding from a person or an agency or an organization. And so your whole goal is to identify and say, I have a hunch that this program's failing, and it is failing, so I'm going to prove that it's failing. And then the second type is really a friendly evaluation, where you meet with the people who are running the company, and they say, look, I don't know what to do. We're not selling any more cars, if that's what you're selling. We're not getting any more people to come into our hair salon, if that's what you're doing. Help us discover what we're doing. And so the purpose is not to tell them that they're doing a bad job. It's to try and help them empower new methods, new vessels, new pathways to improving program success, because the stakeholders are buying into it. And that's not publishable data. You don't share that data, right? Because obviously that data in the wrong hands could be quite dangerous. And so trust becomes really important, going back to your question about ethics and skill set. If you want to have the right skills to be a program evaluator, you need to be perceived as being trusted, because stakeholders are afraid when somebody comes and opens the closets where the ghosts and skeletons are hiding, right? Yeah. Because that's in essence what you're doing. So they need to trust that the program evaluator is not doing it with an agenda to make them look bad.
Okay, and then now you mentioned this notion of stakeholders, and it's something that we're beginning to talk about. How would you classify a stakeholder? Like, what determines one from not one? Tell us about that.
Well, I mean, generally the way that I classify a stakeholder is going to be anyone who's in charge of making decisions that are currently in place, because they're the ones that are going to look bad if I come back and say that the decisions that are in place are terrible. Okay. Right? So stakeholders are going to be the people that have made the decisions that are in place, that have supported what is in place by either funding or publicly vote, being articulate, coming out and saying, we support X, Y, and Z. If you're that person, you're a stakeholder because you're vested in the outcome of what you believe to be an effective program. And if I show that it's not an effective program, that's pretty scary.
Yeah, I imagine delivering that bad news is pretty challenging communicatively.
Yeah, it is. And so going back to what are the required skills of a program evaluator, if you're going to be invited into somebody's world where their life and their legacy and their ethos is on the line, you have to make sure out on the very outset conversation that you have with someone is, my goal and objective here is for me not to have fame. My goal and objective here is for me not to tarnish you. My goal and objective is for me not to disclose this information to everybody. Mm-hmm. My goal and objective is to tell you what you're doing well, what you're doing badly, what are the obstacles that are in your path to securing the goals that you've set. Mm-hmm. And because typically this is in relationship to a grant, right? So again, if I'm called in, it's because somebody's been given, $10 million to implement a specific goal. And the funders of that grant, let's say it's Bill Gates, has said, we agree that this is a worthwhile goal. Now the problem is, how do you achieve that goal? And you can't just say at the end of the 5 years, oops. What you have to do is you create the evaluation. And as you know, with grants, you have to create an evaluation narrative that is concurrent with your project narrative. In other words, a really good program is one where you create what your desired outcomes are 5 years from now, and you've done that is systematically partnered with what are the potential obstacles and what are our benchmarks along the way, so we can go, we've got a problem, or actually this is going better than we thought. Mm-hmm. It's about being strategic. So program evaluation is two things. It really is about looking at what's happening and providing recommendations for improved practice and for avoiding obstacles. But secondly, if it's done really well, it's done from the very beginning. Mm-hmm. So as we go back to the beach scene in Redondo Beach, we're not just walking down in that setting looking at what is there, but we're also asking ourselves, what is an achievable goal 5 years from now for this beach to look like? Because what we're going to say when we apply for that funding is, here's our vision. Here's how we think K through 12 education can be in 5 years. Mm-hmm. Here's how we think manufacturing can be in 5 years. Here's how we think we can make our new governor in 5 years. Here's how we think we can make the pollution levels at Redondo Beach in 5 years. And then working our way backwards and saying, in order to achieve X, we need to have done A, B, C, D, and E along the way.
So
And
it's
so
like
then
it's like tying those areas, I guess, to the ultimate outcomes. Is that what you're essentially saying? Like lining them up on some level.
yeah, the ultimate outcome is what the evaluation hopes to achieve.
Okay.
Right?
Well, that's great. Yeah. So that gives us a really great overview to start with. I guess I'd leave us with one more question, and that is, what kind of advice would you give my students or anyone who's doing first-time program evaluation? What are some tips or areas that you would recommend we think about?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is, and this is where it gets very, very interesting, and this is the beauty of why anyone can be a program evaluator. You have to really look at what are the values, right? Like, what do you value in a specific program? Is it to provide free and school lunch? What is it? Yeah, it might cost millions of dollars, and maybe it's badly administered, and maybe there's millions of dollars of wasted food. But what if one child doesn't eat for 48 hours because that program's not in place? I want students to ask the question not only of fact, I want them to ask questions of value. What do we value as a society? What do we value as a community? What can we do sometimes that may not be implemented effectively, but it is securing that the people who are part of our community that don't have access to the things that we do can get access.
Okay. Well, that's very good. Thank you so much for joining us on the show today. We really appreciate it. We look forward to talking with you in the future. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you so much, Pam. We'll talk to you soon.
Okay, sounds great.
Bye-bye.
You are watching DHTV from California State University, Dominguez Hills.
It was great to learn from Dr. Moss and understand some of the basic parts of program evaluation. As we think about it, you could hear a general theme of simplicity. And I want to stop and talk about that to say that we need to, as researchers, not forget that there is a whole big picture out there. Sometimes when I teach, I talk about how we are distant or close up to the objects that we study. And so you heard from Dr. Moss this general idea that we don't want to get so caught up with the information right in front of us that we don't have a really good overarching perspective of that object. And so when we think about program evaluation, let's make sure that we're doing both the up-close analysis as well as the distant analysis in terms of keeping it simple. Now, one of the things you heard from Dr. Moss is the notion of using mixed methods. And this kind of really circles up this research design course for us in terms of balance. And it offers us a context where we might find value in using what we call mixed methods, or the idea that we could integrate qualitative and quantitative methods in the same project. What are we doing? Trying to benefit other people through our research, something we talked about in our first session, in fact. And that we do that by analyzing these programs that are out there in order to help other people reach higher levels of effectiveness. So today we've talked about survey design. We've talked about the basics regarding survey design. And then we also started to explore the idea of program evaluation. And as we think about both of those together, we can see how they would work together to help solve some puzzles in our world. Well, that's about it for today and our show. Thank you for joining us. And I hope that we'll see you next time as we talk about more important processes of data analysis as well as data collection. But for now, I sign off and say, this is Dr. Pamela Kreiser, wishing you a day that is not just different, but significantly different.